Hi, welcome back to chapter 18 from our story, Wild Boy. The painting swung open with a hiss of brown air. Wild Boy and Clarissa stepped back, horrified by the reek that rushed from within. Whatever was in Dr. Griffin's secret room, it smelled even worse than the classroom upstairs. The painting creaked on hinges hidden in the frame, and Wild Boy's candlelight fluttered in the stale breeze. "I'll go first," he said. "Why you?" Clarissa replied. "You ain't breather than me. We'll go together." They lifted their feet slowly through the frame and set them on creaky floorboards on the other side. The room was long and narrow, with a wooden work table against one of the brick walls. Fingers of fog tapped at a window, eager to be let in. Clarissa edged closer to Wild Boy. Her heavy breath tickled the hair on his neck. "Are you scared?" she said. I ain't scared of nothing," Wild Boy replied. "Me neither." They crept deeper into the thin passage. Several jars from the doctor's museum sat on the work table, except these didn't contain human body parts. "Animals," Clarissa said. Wild Boy leaned closer, his eyes wide with fascination. "Not just animals," he said. His candle lit the suspended corpses of a cat, a puppy with its tongue lolling out, a rat shaved of its fur. It looked like the doctor had experimented on the poor creatures. Thin copper rods stuck from their floating bodies, and wires hung from clips on their limbs. Only one of the animals had been left untouched, a fat eel coiled up and floating in the golden fluid. Wild Boy tapped the jar curiously. He'd seen an eel like that before. The eel moved. Wild Boy lurched back in fright. The candle slipped from his hand, plunging the chamber into darkness. "What?" Clarissa said. "What is it?" "It's alive, that thing in the jar." Blue light crackled around the room, and Wild Boy remembered where he'd seen a creature like that. Back at the fair, Professor Wollstonecraft had performed tricks with an eel that sparkled when it got angry. An electric eel, he'd called it. Clarissa gripped his arm. "I can't see." "Wait." Wild Boy picked up the jar and gave it a shake. The eel bashed its head angrily against the glass. Blue sparks shimmered around its sluggish body, flashing light about the narrow chamber. "Sorry, Slimy," Wild Boy said. There were more jars along the worktop. In these floated human body parts that had also been used for Dr. Griffin's tests. Metal tubes stuck from the rubbery ventricles of a heart, and silver cogs clung to its fleshy sides. In another jar, a pair of lungs had been grafted with copper wires. "What is that?" Clarissa said. Beside an empty jar on the work table sat a small cage made of thin silver bars. Inside the cage was a shriveled grey ball with a dozen copper wires emerging from its sides. The wires were connected to the bars so that they held the ball suspended like a fat spider in the centre of its web. This rotten object was clearly the source of the stench in this chamber. Green pus oozed out from its base and dripped to the bottom of the cage. "What is it?" Clarissa said. Wild Boy leaned closer, wrapping an arm around his nose to mask the smell. He recognised the object from pictures in the doctor's books. "It's a brain," he said. Several more books lay beside the cage, but these weren't about anatomy. One was titled Journal of the Inductive Sciences. Another was called Electrical Theory of the Universe. Inside, there were drawings of scientific devices like those that Professor Wollstonecraft had used in his circus show. "Electricity," Wild Boy muttered. He picked up a small notebook from among the pile and shook the eel jar to see the pages. It was crammed with the results of the doctor's experiments, sketches of bodies and machines, equations, and scribbled writing. The words seemed to swirl in the candlelight as a wave of exhaustion washed over Wild Boy. So far, all they'd found were more frustrating questions. He wished he could rest and think, far away from the police and the fear of getting caught. "Are there any clues in that book?" Clarissa said. "I don't know." "What about that worm thing? Is that a clue?" Wild Boy banged the jar down. "Stop asking so many questions, will you?" As he spoke, a spark of electricity shot from the eel jar and hit the cage. Clarissa pulled Wild Boy back as a faint blue light crackled around the silver bars, growing brighter, and then, whoosh, the light shot into the cage. Wild Boy and Clarissa watched, amazed, as all of the wires began to glow. Electricity rushed along them and into the brain. For a second, the oozing organ shone bright blue, lit from inside. Then it began to twitch, shaking the cage on the table. And then the light cut out. Silence. Darkness. "Let's get out of here," Clarissa said. She rushed back along the chamber and jumped through the open painting. Wildboy stuffed the doctor's notebook in his coat pocket as another crackle of electricity shimmered around the rotten surface of the brain. "What is going on here?" he whispered. He turned to follow Clarissa but stopped. There was a light in the museum. "Clarissa?" he said. No reply. The light flickered. Wildboy glanced to the window, thinking he could escape while he could. But what about Clarissa? They were in this together now, and he still owed her for saving him at the fair. He couldn't just leave her. His hands trembled as he edged closer to the hole in the wall. "Who's there?" he called. "If it's you coppers, then you'd better run, 'cause I'm a cold-blooded killer and I'm coming out." Still no reply. Slowly he stepped into the museum, and immediately he wished he hadn't. An oil lamp sat on one of the cabinets. The police were here. An officer lay unconscious and bleeding on the floor between the shelves. A tall, cloaked figure stood over him. It was the hooded man. His gloved hand clamped around Clarissa's neck, lifting her several inches from the floor. He looked up at Wildboy, and dark eyes glinted behind his porcelain mask. "The Wildboy of London," he said. "You are just in time to watch your friend die."